Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from Down. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, at the top of the year, we welcome back the podcast's Astrology in residence, the one and only Austin Coppock, to talk about the space weather we have coming up in 2017. Austin! Hello.
Hey, Gordon. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. End of the fucking year.
Yeah, well, almost. I think it'll be an interesting 2 weeks before it's actually over, but just about there.
Yeah, there's a lot of things going on, kind of upstairs and downstairs between now and counting down to 2017.
Yes, there are. There are things. There's the electoral college, whatever that ends up looking like. I mean, whatever it ends up looking like, people will be upset, and it will mean something. Even if it's not the blatant revocation of the Trump presidency, I think some sort of landmark is going to be set there. And then we also, just on a purely astrological level, we get the first taste of a couple configurations, which will be back multiple times in 2017 during the last week of this year. So we've spoken about this whilst not recording. In a lot of ways, you mentioned this. In a lot of ways, 2017 is kind of like a continuation of 2016. So if we're talking here at the end of 2016, perhaps we should kind of give an overview of the skies we just went through in this remarkable year. Yes, there have been many remarks about this year.
Yes, literally remarkable. Remarks have been made.
Indeed. So I guess the easiest way to summarize 2016 from an astrological point of view, and of course in a way that intersects with a non-astrological point of view, is by looking at sort of the two big configurations. One was a really intense, unusually intense Mars retrograde, which, if you count the full cycle, ran about 2/3 of the year. And, the theme with that, whenever you have Mars highlighted, as he most definitely was, and in signs very strong and closest to the Earth as he is in his cycle and all that business, people fight a lot. People fight verbally, things get nasty, poisonous, contentious, and generally there's a lot of military action, right? And we saw a lot of fighting in the Middle East this year. A lot of towns and cities have changed, have been gained or lost, and people were really shitty and cruel to each other in general on the social media and in person, right? Oh, and it killed a lot of people, right? It killed a lot of good people, which is especially irritating. A lot of people lost their legends this year. So that was Mars. That happened.
It did. Now let's just stay on that for a bit. As it's moved out of that kind of horrible configuration, I mean, it's a reasonably fast-moving planet. It's interesting that it does broadly correlate with macro themes such as risk of war with Russia rising, risk of war with Russia declining, except now there's a sort of death rattle of Putin is an all-powerful Bond supervillain who can move things with his mind, and all these kind of invented narratives that have come along with what I would consider to be a sign that Mars is getting less shit, which is the sort of defeat of Al-Qaeda in Aleppo. So it almost looks like we are cooling off some things that have been just the most astonishing and horrible disasters. Does it have a death rattle, or is this sort of Reds under the bed scam not going to go anywhere?
Yeah, okay. I have a couple things to say about that. One, you mentioned Mars. You describe Mars as a relatively fast-moving planet, which is totally true. Except, what's interesting is during some parts of that retrograde phase, Mars is way slower than Saturn or Jupiter. It actually slows down to a crazy degree. Mars's speed, not only the brightness, but also and the motion, but also the speed is very different during those retrograde phases. So it's kind of interesting. It almost becomes like an outer planet, or we've talked about the outer planets. Like if you're Saturn, you have a 29.5 year cycle, then you can time things that move at that speed, and it's almost like Mars becomes an indicator for bigger and more long-term things when he's moving that slowly.
Yeah. And he scraped backwards and forwards across the windscreen in 2016. It was awful.
Usually, just to compare, usually takes Mars about 5 weeks to go through a sign, right, which is 1/12 of a circle or 30 degrees. So it took Mars about 8.5 months to do about 18 degrees. Right? That's crazy slow. So about, with the Putin Russian thing, I don't see that. I mean, I don't see what is being talked about right now and the way it is being talked about being a dominant theme. One thing that I see that I find irritating on Facebook is people will see that and be like, you know what, that's probably kind of bullshit. But then they'll be like, America is the bad guy, and Putin is the good guy, and versus Putin is the bad guy and America is the good guy. And I implore the people of the world to
please have some nuance.
Well, just like when you're looking at gigantic nation states, which are very motivated by power, please don't try to find the good guy and the bad guy.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, maybe that happens every now and again, but I, if anything, start with the assumption that they both have interests and are competing.
Yes, it's Game of Thrones, and we have a fictional model for it. They're bad guys. You don't get to be powerful without being bad. No one, you don't find the good guy in this. There isn't a King Arthur in the corner. You're dealing with the literal Game of Thrones.
Yeah, and so I mean, and I think it's a lot easier to analyze in terms of just power rather than, I don't know, right and wrong. Good Lord.
Unfortunately, we've had a 50-year Cold War narrative forced down multiple generations of throats around the world that is associated with things like American exceptionalism that makes it very difficult for people to add nuance or complexify how they understand geopolitics, because that's something they learned through film and comics and everything from a very early age. Yeah. But these kind of dominant stories are not a match for the world we're in.
Yeah, now that you mention it, it's kind of interesting because, there was a Soviet side to that narrative as well. They had their, filthy American capitalist propaganda.
Absolutely.
And we had our filthy commie propaganda. And it's almost like Russia has rediscovered the power of that narrative, especially at a time when the United States has its pants down in a lot of ways, and people can see the the emperor's bed sores.
Yeah.
But it's almost like a resumption of an older thing rather than this totally new thing. The idea that,
it's more, it's better than, I have much to say about this. It's not even, when you say resumption of older, you're more right than you may actually realize, because one of the things, and this is something Dr. Farrell talks about because he's familiar with Eastern Orthodoxy, one of the things Putin does very well is match his visuals to an older than Soviet Russian worldview. So when he gives his announcements, the big these beautiful Kremlin Palace doors open, and it has the he's waking up a worldview of Russian culture. And if he's doing it, or if someone on his team is doing it, they're doing a very good job of it. Americans aren't as good at that kind of stuff as non-Americans. So, the Queen is obviously the Queen at it, but he's got he's very deliberately, and it's really important from a Eurasian expansion perspective, because the role of Moscow in the Orthodox Church from a Eurasian perspective is the protection of Christians throughout the kind of Middle East, that sort of former Byzantine footprint. So he's playing a game that I mean, I could see it because I, listen to what Dr. Farrell says, but you're right. I mean, we're not dealing with good and bad guys here. You're dealing with people. It's in the Russian national interest to have that image restored, and it's working. It's working not just on its own, it's working because of the West's foreign policy disasters in the Middle East, but it is working, and his influence is growing throughout Eurasia.
Yeah, indeedly. So, hold on. I'm just I want to find our way back to where we started on that, because I feel like we could talk about that for an hour, and that would be the Russia podcast.
No, we'll... are either of us up for that? I don't know if we're the right people for that show.
No, I think it would be entertaining for us and mediocre for everyone else.
Gordon and Austin speculate about Russia based on things they hear on the internet. That's what we're doing now.
I listened to a 40-hour series of lectures on Russian history once, and that's about all I got. I basically took one class by stealing from the internet.
It's not true. I mean, we're hopefully reasonably informed about various things, but you're correct. We should get back to space.
Okay, so there was Mars, right? And I want to say a nice thing about Mars. That Mars cycle is really intense, and when Mars goes wrong, or when Mars attacks, it's really obvious. Like you stub your foot, you burn your hand really badly making French fries and feel like a fool. You hurt your knees. A colleague attacks you. On a macro scale, it looks like war and contentiousness. But Mars isn't, strictly villainous. I got a lot done this year, and I've talked to a lot of people who are quietly like, yeah, I kind of kicked a lot of ass this year. But in terms of sort of the simplified Facebook narrative that people tell about this year, that nobody wants to say like, actually, I got a lot done. It's like, no, everything was awful. We can all agree and commiserate about that. But I saw a lot of people, how should we say, hone their martial virtue and become victorious regardless or even because of the resistance or strife facing them.
It's a good way of describing it, and I want people listening to think about that as we're at the end of the year. How much ass did you kick?
There was definitely a lot of ass served up this year for kicking. That can be the tagline for this discussion.
So that was that was one of the two main configurations that defined 2016.
And the other was the sort of reality melter. It was the Saturn square Neptune. And so we talked about, I know we talked about this 6 months ago. I think we might have talked about it 6 months before that too. So this is Saturn and Neptune in a square 90-degree angle configuration from Earth's perspective. And so basically Saturn is like real and facts, and Neptune is what people imagine. And there's nothing inherently wrong or stupid about the imagination. I love the imagination. We can imagine things that are true as well. But when Saturn and Neptune get into a hard configuration like they were in all last year, or this year, I suppose, you get the facts get in the way of fantasies and vice versa. It's it's sort of the opposite of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? It's the like, well, I don't know. It's something gross with something that doesn't work with it at all. It's a there's
octopus smoothie.
Yeah, an octopus, perfect. Although that's probably a delight somewhere. That sounds like an acquired taste. Honestly, I might be able to get into that. But basically, it what that one does is it wonks reality. And so you get things like like Pokemon Go, where you have thousands of people tromping around looking for beasts whose ontological value is questionable. You get the rash of fake news on Facebook, everywhere, and from an American perspective, we got an election where we didn't really know who was lying or about what. It wasn't like there was a lot of there was so much falsehood going around in so many different degrees. It just became really difficult to tell who and what was what.
And reality melting is the perfect description for it, because if Saturn's data points is talking about the particular American experience, if Saturn's data points and Neptune is imaginings, then that pretty much defines the imperial worldview. When you say America's caught with its pants down, I wouldn't necessarily say that, because I love America. I would say the empire is caught with its pants down. We've actually just kind of seen how gross they are, and it's been a weird combination of actual data points, so contents of emails, and then imaginings about how those emails came about, and you have a fight between things in your head and things that are data, and it melted reality.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we've talked before about the importance for America moving forward to separate what it means to be an American from what it means to be the seat of empire.
Yes.
One more thing about the Saturn-Neptune is that it timed and described the refugee crisis very well. On a physical level, Saturn refers to structures with walls. Physical boundaries are very important when you're in Saturn land. And then Neptune is named, of course, for a god of the ocean, and refers to that which seeps through the cracks. Right, that which finds, water finds a way. And so I summarized the Saturn-Neptune square, at the beginning of the year, as waves and walls, right? And you literally, not only do you have, a refugee immigrant action much more resembling water, right? If we're going to use an elemental or state of matter metaphor. And of course, nation states, some literally have walls, and those boundaries, those geopolitical boundaries, are in some ways more real than physical walls. And you had a clash there, right? You had those two intersecting in a way that was probably not very fun for anybody involved.
Yeah, to put it mildly. When did this configuration end, or has it ended?
Okay, so this guy started in September of 2015, or maybe it was August. Anyway, let's say late third quarter of 2015, and then because of the relative speeds and motions, they did a couple more clashes, exact 90-degree angles, and we had our last 90-degree angle between those two that we're going to have for a very long time. In September. And so right now they're sort of separating, and we're in what I would call the hangover period of that. And so everyone a lot of people have this experience of, oh, darn it, I was fooled, right? Or they lied to me. I'm not. And what's interesting is what I'm seeing now is this very understandable but kind of mechanical reaction to being fooled, which is, I'm never going to believe anything again. I'm going to assume everybody's lying about everything, which is not a sound epistemology, right? There's a difference between thinking and unthinking skepticism. But that's very typical of the Saturn-Neptune. The outcome of Saturn-Neptune configurations is they produce at their end disillusionment. Right, which is not the same as clarity.
Yeah, it's interesting that it finished up in September, and Mars is, cooling off's the wrong word, but Mars is being less of a dick. Mm-hmm. So if you were, and I find that interesting, given this week's news, we're recording this less than a week before it goes out, so it's close enough to news. If you were a shadowy astrologer who consults for an even shadowier billionaire, one we don't know, would it be your geopolitical assessment that the combination of these two and the sort of burning out of Al-Qaeda from Aleppo indicate that? Because if the refugee crisis mapped the Saturn configuration, and we're kind of coming out of that as we're coming out of that sort of risk of war aspect to Mars's behavior. If you were asked by a billionaire, it's like, does that mean Syria is going to start getting better? Better in this context is
here,
no fighting.
So, okay, so will Syria get better in 2017? I'm changing the context a little bit. I would put money on that. I would put that at like maybe 70%, 75%. Will Syria get better during the first quarter of 2017? I don't think so. Mars heats up again during the first quarter. We get Mars, and so traditionally Mars is strongest in two positions, right? In Scorpio and in Aries. And half of the retrograde in 2016 was in Scorpio, which is part of why it was so sharp and hot. Mars's phase isn't quite as intense this year, but Mars in Aries is always let's say very vigorous. And there's some other stuff that goes on in Aries first quarter. There's a Venus retrograde in Aries. There's certainly there's some flashpoints first quarter. But I think that but I think that makes sense because it's not like Syria is ready to just call it a day and everybody to lay down arms. Like they're probably going to need to be some more decisive battles one way or another.
Yeah, it's not in a good place. It's not time to book your holiday.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, you mentioned 2017. Before we get into kind of H1, Manstrologize 2017 for us, Austin.
Okay, so I'm going to try to summarize. I've just been basically obsessing about 2017 every day for the last couple weeks. But
that's the job.
Yeah, you're the first person I'm going to try to break it down coherently to. So
nice.
That's both your gift and curse. So one of the simplest but most, I think, overwhelming and dominant patterns in the astrology of 2017 is that there is a lot of fire. And by fire, I mean planets sitting in fire signs. In particular, there's an overwhelming amount of action in the last third or last decan of all three fire signs. So Saturn will be in the last decan of Sagittarius all year. Uranus will be in the last decan of Aries all year. We get 2 eclipses in the last decan of Leo, and we actually get 5 Mercury stations in the last decan of fire signs this year. We get a direct station in the first week of January, and then in May we get a direct station at the end of Aries conjunct Uranus. That'll be interesting. And we get a direct station at the end of Leo, and we get a retrograde station on Saturn during the very last days of the year. And that's in Sagittarius. So there's just a lot of big action in fire signs, right? 2 outer planets there the whole time, and then 5 Mercury stations and 2 eclipses, right? So fire everywhere. And in addition to that, I was thinking about this from other angles, and if you look at the root and stem in the Chinese system, it's the year of the fire rooster, right? And so it's another fire year. That's another way that this year is paired with last year, is that in the Chinese yearly system, the same element phase of the Wuxing will repeat 2 years in a row. So so 2016 was fire monkey, and then 2017 is fire rooster. So we've got a doubling of fire there. And then even if you were to switch your zodiac and do the sidereal zodiac, which is closer to the stellar, which is what they use in Hindu or Vedic or Indian astrology, as well as some Western astrologers use that. You still get almost everything in fire signs. It's just in the beginning of fire signs rather than at the end of fire signs. So that seems to be a very definite theme, right? The question then is, well, so what do we make of that, right? So what is what is it like to be in a situation that we can characterize by the qualities associated with a given element, right? So first, fire is the lightest, most energetic, and most unpredictable of the four elements or states of matter, right? Gases, liquids, and solids all have more structure. The energy is, the particles are bound up in all of that. Whereas fire is in many ways, an unbinding, which releases heat and light and noise. And so I would expect, one, things to not proceed in an orderly manner, right? And I mean, that's sort of, anybody I think could look at where things are now and say that, but it's important to note that that's confirmed, right? That the cards also say that, the planets also say that.
And there's just to interrupt there to add to it for people listening, the value of knowing that in advance is you can moderate your response to it on an unpredictable event by unpredictable event basis, because it's kind of just that point in the timeline, rather than panicking about things not conforming to prior structures. This is just what happens, and there's a tremendous amount of upside in kind of keeping that in your head.
Yeah, well, and so for one thing, let me plug your book. I think this is an excellent year to be engaging in strategies that maximize optionality. That Chaos Protocols has some really good tips for this year.
And this show's coming out just before Christmas, so yes,
yes, treat yourself. No, but seriously, I have in my notes, I was like writing down strategies, and I wrote down like 3 or 4 things, and I was like, oh, what Gordon said. This is, I would say this is a bad year to have very detailed plans that are sensitive to each sequence unfolding in a particular way. This is it's not a great year for master plans. It's a for grand designs. It's more like how, get here with, based on what the situation looks like. Once you get to that next sort of, I guess, video game wise save point, then, okay, now how do things look from here? All right, do the next step. One of the metaphors that was coming to me when I was writing about it was, if it was an Olympic sport, it's like a decathlon. There's a lot of different stuff you need to do. It's not, because at first I started with this metaphor of like a marathon. And I was like, no, that's not right, because you know exactly what to expect in a marathon. You're just going to keep fucking jogging, Whereas this is going to be, it's like a decathlon where they surprise you with like, okay, now you're going to do this. Now you're going to do this. But I've never done that before. Too bad. That's what this month is about. And so I think that flexibility is going to be rewarded this year. But I want to get back to what I was saying about master plans, because what I'm not saying is don't have long-term goals, right? Sometimes, I think some people are like, okay, I will go back to just getting by, right? Just getting by is one way of being flexible, but there's a really, I think, productive tension between being tactically flexible while strategically fixed, right? Being like, no, I am journeying east. How I get there is going to be dependent on the the weather and the mountain passes, and
it's shortwave optionality. So if people are listening and want to go back and read the Captain Jack Sparrow post, it's a year for Captain Jack Sparrowing.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, decathlon, or I was thinking, it also reminds me of. I was like, if it was a video game, it might be like what they call Metroidvanias, where you're like jumping and shooting and running around in a structure and having to double back. And now you've got the key. Now you got to go back to the first level and you can unlock a door and there's a new area. I know you're not a gamer, Gordon, but
no, that word was even weirder than the astrological words. I'm like, no, I have no idea.
Yeah, so a Metroidvania is a reference to Castlevania and Metroid, which were early early standouts in really established that genre.
There you go.
Anyway, but another thing about this is like a thing about fire, and it's also sort of a contrast with 2016. So 2016 was fiery. There's a lot of fire, and there's also, whenever you have strong Mars, it's fiery. It doesn't matter what sign it's in. If Mars is super strengthened, you experience it as being heated. However, I feel like, or my take on it at this point is that 2017's heat is a little bit more evenly distributed and a little bit less napalmy than Mars. I think that sure, there will be contention. Sure, people will be angry, right? That's not going away. But I think it's going to be less heated and less acute than it was in 2015. And from a Chinese astrological point of view, 2016 was a yang fire year, whereas 2017 is a yin fire year. So it's a little softer, a little bit less sharp, a little bit less acute.
We've spoken about this in the context of, and this will kind of move us, we'll pick it back up again, but we've spoken about this in the context of Martin Armstrong's Socrates AI ECM cycles. And he describes a phase transition is, which he takes from physics. So a phase transition is when water kind of bubbles and bubbles and bubbles, and then it transitions its phase to steam. And
which is exactly what the four elements map to in physics. Is they're literally the four discrete states of matter.
Correct. And he's looking at the possibility of, because the Dow's going to end up at 20,000 by the end of the year, and it's going to wobble in Q1, and we're going to sort of talk about the first half of the year a little bit later. And then there are some other directional changes where it sort of bounces, and then it's possibly off to the moon around Q3. And this is kind of the first time the sort of models have showed up that there will be a phase transition. It could well be the phase transition in around Q3 of this year. And I just wanted to drop that in because I assume we're going to hit a couple of the high points in the 2017 overview now.
Sure. Actually, before I get to that, one more thing about fire. Fire creates a lot of light, right? A lot of images. You don't have spectacle without fire, right? No other state of matter off-puts energy like that, and therefore no other state of matter will demand your attention. I think that there's going to be a lot of spectacle with a lot less consequences. I mean, not that nothing consequential will happen, but I think there's going to be a lot of huffing and puffing. I think that, some interesting shifts will happen, but there's going to be twice as much huffing and puffing as there might be in other years.
Could we say, is it stretching it too much to say that a fire year is a Plato's cave year? Do you know what I mean? So there's stuff that's throwing off pictures on the wall, but that's not actually real. I just get a really strong sense that there's going to be a lot of drama that's distracting that doesn't necessarily mean all that much. There are going to be some meaning. It's almost like it's like a shell game with drama, right? There are 3 dramas, but only one of them is real. Does that make sense? Yes.
Yeah. And that's that, and I guess that makes and just to drop back to the decathlon model where you have you're asked to play a different game at each step. Some of the games will just be a waste of time, like figuring out what the real game is, and that's on an internal level as well as a politics and power watching level. I think it,
I get what you're saying there. I know exactly what you're saying, and in fact, I would probably take it a step further and say the only game next year is realizing that there are these 3 games and only one of them is real. So, I'm experiencing this with the video Q&A, that people are asking me kind of like in the weeds questions about stuff that is not real. What do you think about this fucking Keck frog thing? I'm like, no part of that is real or relevant. Step back and actually look at the patterning of culture and this kind of reaction stuff. So the game for 2017 could be realizing that there's a drama shell game, as you point out, and that gives you an indication, kind of like what I said before, I suspect, of how much emotion you actually put into these possibly quite, possibly fake dramas.
Yeah, right. Yeah. There are a lot of dramas that you don't want to be fuel for. One thing I always liked about the Yi Zhang and the trigrams, when they talk about the fire trigram, one of the names associated with it, the way it's translated, is they call it the clinging. They call fire clinging because fire clings to its fuel source. Fire is is one of the hungriest states of matter. It can't exist without fuel, right? And quickly exhausts its fuel. And I feel like there's a lesson there about these very bright and sometimes entertaining dramas.
So don't be fuel in a fire year.
Yeah, you're not going to need to fuel.
No, but don't be the fuel is kind of what you're saying there. Because in a fire year, if you're caught up in some of these dramas, you are the thing. It is using your energy to burn.
Right. And of course, one of the dangers when you have any chart that's too full of fire, whether it's a human beings or a year's, is you have the possibility of burnout, right? And burnout is what happens when you are out of fuel, right? Fire leaves ash behind, which is a very, by definition, the fuel has been, the fuel is no longer part of the ash. The fuel or the ash is by definition not fuel. And so if you end up feeding everything that wants your attention this year, then you'll end up burnt out. You'll be the ash for periods of time until you have to go through the whole growth cycle to turn ash into something useful, right? Mm-hmm. Ash can fertilize the soil, and then the soil, if it's cultivated correctly and there's rain and sunshine, you can get some plants, but that's a long way to go for more logs. It might be easier just to not burn all your logs.
I like it.
So, but you were talking about the third quarter. So one of the sort of most blatant, pieces of celestial action next year is we get a total solar eclipse on August 21st. And eclipses aren't that rare. There are pretty much always 4 eclipses a year, 2 lunar, 2 solar. A total solar is pretty interesting. And this one's super interesting. This is a total solar eclipse at 28 degrees Leo, tropical, where the totality will be visible from the west coast to the east coast of the United States. It just passes over. It starts at the west around Seattle and then exits more, I think it's maybe between Georgia and Washington, but it just goes right over. So everybody in the United States will be able to look up and see a solar eclipse that day. And eclipses the solars haven't been visible in the U.S. since 1979, and the last time we had one that went from sea to shining sea like that was 1918. So that's we're talking about short cycle indicators versus long cycle indicators. That's a big one. That doesn't happen very often. And what's really interesting is part of astrology, for those who haven't studied it, part of what we do is we look at the positions in a person's chart when they're born relative to what's happening, right? And so what's interesting is in Donald Trump's chart that solar eclipse happens within a degree of his rising sign and right on top of his natal Mars. So that's just bang on the nose of the chart. So, that's pretty interesting. And there's other stuff going on then too and the rest of the year, but that's a really simple one to single out. And it's something people will be talking about. It'll be all over the social medias because it's a big thing that everyone can see.
And in presumably by then President Trump's case, what could that kind of thing potentially indicate?
Oh God. Okay. So, all right, so just a little bit about eclipses. When we're interpreting eclipses, we're basically taking the meaning of a new moon. An eclipse is just a new moon or a dark moon, and a lunar eclipse is just a full moon, right? But they're perfect. What's interesting is that eclipses appear as anomalies, but they're actually more perfect alignments of the Sun, Moon, Earth system. Right, we can only see the full moon unshadowed because things are arranged a little funky, because the Sun, Moon, and Earth are not in a straight line. And so what's interesting is the eclipses seem to, my experience of them and my study of them is they open up gateways for change to occur at a much deeper level. One very simple way of saying it is that the latent becomes apparent during eclipses, right? It's like mythologically, it's like it's like, in some fantasy thing, it's like, you wait for the sun and moon to align perfectly, and then this weird gate to the underworld built thousands of years ago, like clicks into alignment and opens, and things escape from that hidden realm, but it also grants entrance into it. And so you get a lot of, what's interesting is, having looked at the charts of a number of truly obsessive occultists, you have a ton of eclipse cycle births. And also, when their souls escape from Hades, right? But then you also, having, being, some kind of wizard myself, I've noticed that things get weird and interesting in the little bardos that the eclipses open up. So just on a very simple level, things can happen that usually don't happen under eclipses. Now, the eclipses happen when the sun and moon line up, either on the head or tail of the dragon. Right, the dragon, or the north and south node of the moon, is something that that we started calculating in, I think, the 6th century BC. Thank you, Neo-Babylonians. But it draws on a much more ancient mythological motif, right? The dragon that swallows the sun and moon. And so the head and the tail are obviously not the same thing. And they don't act the same way in astrology. Generally, the north node, which is the head, that's something emerging from the gateway that the eclipse opens up. You get more of something, sometimes monstrously more. And then with the south node, the other side, which is the tail, a lot of times something disappears. It's like that gate sucks something up. But the thing is, you get eclipses moving as a cycle where they bounce back and forth between a pair of opposed signs. So one of the things that happens in 2017 is our eclipses move to the Leo and Aquarius axis, which means the eclipses will be bouncing back and forth between Aquarius and Leo. And so even though that one this coming summer is the most dramatic of the series, it's generally, what the changes that the eclipses augur are generally take that year and a half that each series takes to really manifest. And so we're switching out of the Virgo Pisces series in pretty early in 2017 and switching into this Leo Aquarius. So weird stuff happens. I know a lot of astrologers who do who look at election astrology, and a lot of times eclipses, like in a prominent part of a person's chart, are big, like because they signify big moves, like quantum leaps, rather than steady motion and established direction, are often used to judge as one of the factors as whether a person will take office. Like Barack Obama had a bunch of eclipses in key sectors of his chart when he was elected.
So if they happen in Q3, there's a number of indications. He could die, he could get assassinated, he could leave the job, he could have his job dramatically change. These are the kind of things that we don't know until we get there, but they are typically associated with that sort of space weather.
Yeah. And the thing is, usually, or often, the North Node side of eclipses is positive. Because it's sort of like the more button. In Vedic astrology, that's the North Node or head is called Rahu, and Rahu is often pictured as not having a lower body and being monstrously hungry. and being hungry for success, wealth, power, everything, right? And the idea is he doesn't have a stomach, so he never gets full, right? It's the more without limit is a part of the archetype or outline of that. And of course, Donald Trump has that conjunct his sun natally. Just saying. But usually when you have one of those on the ascendant, it's usually good for the person's success. However, it's right next to his Mars. And his Mars is not so positive in his chart. And so you wonder if that's, the Mars is literally people fighting him getting taken down. I don't have a prediction about it. I have several exclamation points that I'll put next to it. Like that's a thing, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the frustrating and amazing things about astrology is you can point to a period of time and go, there. What exactly? You're like there, right? And so that'll become clear, and it'll probably be obnoxiously clear in hindsight. But that's a really important point.
And just for people who care to speculate, because Austin and I have been talking about this offline, the fact that for me it lines up with a major direction change in the ECM, because I showed Austin the array, which is very difficult to read, but Armstrong built it, he can make it look as hideous as he wants. There is an interpretation that could be if we start to get the phase transition in the Dow, and for people who don't know what the Dow is, it's a ridiculously anachronistic index of the largest private sort of listed companies, big industrial companies and banks in the US. So when people talk about the Dow, what they actually mean is very, very large private companies. Now, if that takes off, if it gets its phase transition, that only comes with a further very dangerous collapse in global bond markets. Not dangerous, but alarming. So if that does happen, his job will actually change because essentially from a global business perspective, the only game in town is literally going to be essentially US exchanges. And so that may well line up with it if the phase transition comes. I mean, obviously, we don't want anyone to die. And as you say, it could be just a career change. But that would, by definition, if we start to get, which we're about to talk about in the longer cycles, if the dollar gets to over 120 as an index by then, and the Dow starts taking off, by definition, he becomes president of the world because the kind of energy of the financial system is there. So it's a career change without him having to go anywhere. And that I find interesting, that the space weather's kind of lined up with a thing that Armstrong's been saying is kind of like the next step in our phase transition of economics.
Yeah, that makes sense. That also hooks into the difference between this year, right, or this coming year, which is 2016 part 2, and the rest of the decade. The space weather changes significantly in 2018 in a way that'll hold through 2020. And the simplest part of that is Saturn moving into Capricorn. And that transition, Saturn's movement from Sagittarius, where it is now, where it's been the last couple of years, into Capricorn, is a big one for the United States financially. Just to drop back to the last time it happened, Saturn was in Sag from 86 to the end of 88, and then Saturn was in Cap from the very end of 88 into 91. And so, you had a crash in 87, but then you actually had that turning into, you had the fundamentals which were not resolved by that smaller correction, pressing down on employment and creating a small recession, right? And then before that, you have the late 50s into the early 60s, also Saturn in Sag and then into Cap. And again, you had some small crash, small recession during the Sag period that didn't get fixed until well into the Cap period. And then for the scary example was Saturn and Sag in the late 20s, and then moving into Cap in 29 through 31, right? Where, obviously things were overheated, and they crashed disastrously. And for anyone who's actually studied the Great Depression in any detail, it wasn't just one crash, right? It was a series of events over like a year that kept beating things down. And I don't knowing, and so we have 3 instances where you have the same story, but it's very different levels of intensity, right? And so it worries me a little bit to see these indicators that the market will get super excited during 2017, because I don't think that Saturn and Cap will be having that.
It's what I suspect will happen is the Q3 stuff that's coming is the official end of a sort of Bretton Woods arrangement of currencies. And the discussion will be made then as, okay, we need to do something else because the dollar will be too strong, and by then you'll have emerging markets or emerging government markets that have declared bankruptcy, and there needs to be a new way, much like the changes that happened to gold at the end of World War II, where all of it was in the US and none of it was in Europe, so that they pegged the dollar to gold and everyone pegged to the dollar. That's the kind of thing that happens when you have a tremendous imbalance. And those are the discussions that are going to, I suspect, happen as the Dow takes off in Q3, and it fizzes in, and the sort of arrival of digital currencies in 2018 correlates with a dramatic rise in real assets, which includes things like stock exchanges and so on. And I think that's where these two things are going to map because we spoke about in the halfway through the year in July or whatever it was, the kind of much larger changes that happen post 2020, which I said I think that correlates with humans becoming a spacefaring civilization in earnest. But it's that kind of move into air from Earth, and a big part of that is going to be the currency change and kind of global currency changes that will happen because of the heating of the dollar and the US.
That makes sense. Yeah, and for people who aren't familiar with the end of 2021 configuration, that's about the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, which is only a 20-year cycle. And so we're in the last quarter of the cycle. It started in 2000, ends at the end of 2020. And so that's one of astrology's most oldest, that's its workhorse for doing history in 20-year units. However, what's really interesting is that basically every 10 of those in a row will be in a sign of the same element. And so we've basically we've had Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions in Earth signs since the beginning of the 19th century, right? So the suggestion there is that physical territory and machines and stuff will change a lot during that period, which they did. And so not only with the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius at the beginning of the next decade are we moving into a new 20-year cycle. And can I just say hallelujah? I haven't really liked this 20-year cycle very much.
Yeah. Well, we spoke about it. This is the one that's correlated with the kind of end game of like a globalist surveillance empire. It kind of rang in the changes with 9/11 and Patriot Acts and so on, and we're seeing it die a death with the sort of hopefully the collapse of the sort of Empire Soros faction, which is sort of what is underneath what's been going on.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that it'll die. Let me just jump back a little bit.
Well, it won't get the throne.
Right. Okay, so what I was saying is that anyway, that one in the beginning of the next decade, it doesn't just end this 20 years. It ends a 200-year arc and begins a new 200-year arc, right? So that's really significant. But before we get there, and so 2017 is the last year before Saturn goes into Capricorn. Okay, Saturn, Capricorn is a serious sign, especially for Saturn. But what's really important is that while Saturn's in Capricorn, it'll meet up with Pluto. The Saturn Pluto cycle is really important for power. And whenever you have Saturn and Pluto together, it's generally super good for conservatives and nationalists. It's good for thickening borders and getting really worried about your neighbor. So this Saturn-Pluto cycle, which is going to end which is where we come to an end beginning 2018 through 20. Whoa, yeah, that was right. It just sounded too complicated.
No,
anyway,
we're following. Hanging on every word.
Okay, the one that ends in a couple years began in the early 80s, and it inaugurated the Reagan-Thatcher era, right? So what's interesting is we come to the end of that one, and what's really interesting is the world is already like dressed for that play. Like you have a lot of nationalist leaders. The right in a lot of countries has been very successful over 2016. And you see, and part of it is madness, and then part of it is withdrawing and trying to be protected from a globalist project whose negative consequences have become very clear, right?
Mark Blyth, the economist, and I think this is probably worth a post at some stage, says that the thing that follows neoliberalism is neo-nationalism. And I think that's very useful to think about, that it maps to some of the negative things that are associated with nationalism, but it also has the kind of, as we're talking about, like the weird economic benefits that come with it. It's interesting. Carry on.
Yeah, and so what's interesting is we've got to do that before we can get to the birth of 200 years, right? We have to do, and Saturn Pluto is, it doesn't guarantee that everybody's going to end up in concentration camps and the horrors of the far right, but that is the configuration under which a lot of those things happen. And so it's close enough to scare the shit out of people. It's already doing that. And I think that it's sort of like, I don't know, this is part of my general thinking, dreaming over the facts, intuiting some, imagining others. It seems to me, with this being the end of a 200-year thing, with this Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn, it's so past-oriented, it's so deep into the past, is that this is where we start to relive, or are afraid that we're going to relive some of our 20th century nightmares, whether they're the 19th and 20th century nightmares, right? Whether it was, whether it was Nazi Germany, or rapacious colonial capitalists, or fucking Stalin and gulags. Like, we have all these nightmares that we thought we just thought we outran them. And I think in form we did, to a certain degree we have, but we've got these bleeding scars all over the collective psyche, and like get the next Twitter or, Instagram or whatever is not going to help us get over that. And so I feel like part of what's coming up is this deep confrontation with the past, and a deep reckoning, because I think that, so if we go back to 2000 versus 2020, right? What's the storyline there? So 2000, as the millennia begins, America won the 20th century. Good for you, America. And now, and we all get to be international capitalists. And there's the internet now. It was like the point. It was, it's like starting at the zenith right before the inevitable decline, right? And a lot of the story of the last 20 years has been resistance in various forms to that, at the same time as the overwhelming spread of globalization. And there have been some great benefits to that. It's lifted, I don't know, a couple 100 million people out of poverty in China. There's been some good stuff, but the resistance to it and the price has been stacking up and stacking up and stacking up. And so I feel like I feel like this decade is going to end with the antithesis fully developed. I feel like instead of ending with synthesis, we're going to end with a cliffhanger where the antithesis is now just as strong as the thesis, but nobody has any new ideas. And that's one of the things that frustrates me generally right now. And I think, you wrote a great post about nostalgia. It was about Gilmore Girls and
Yeah.
member berries. And this is something I've been thinking about a tremendous amount, is people keep wanting to put the present in the story, in the same story structure as a dystopia written in 1982. Right? And they're like, "Oh, I know how this ends. I read Neuromancer." Oh, I know how this ends. I watched The Walking Dead, or I watched Mad Max. Like, everything is just, we've got all these stories about how we're not going to get past this point. But the hopeful stories, and this used to be part of what sci-fi did, is that like somehow we got past this and didn't ruin everything. I was speaking with a friend of mine about this the other day. He's like, "Yeah, we need to clone Gene Roddenberry." Like, we need, like the globalist, just to use my simple thing here, the globalist thesis and the nationalist antithesis, neither of those is going to get the job done. But maybe the tension between them will push people to do some thinking, because we need to imagine our way out of this. And I know that sounds a little silly, but like, you need an idea first. It's
Absolutely. That doesn't sound silly at all. And I think the nostalgia piece is, especially when you're talking about pseudo left commentation in kind of like cultural press or Twitter, you can kind of carbon date people by their references. Like, people will talk about Reagan and Thatcher as if that's somehow still what's been going on in the previous 40 years, when what is in fact gone on is a kind of expansion of a technocratic empire. And you look at it and go, you guys aren't imagining greater. It's and I don't know if we can. And this is kind of my sort of crappy psychoanalytical version of it. The other part of nostalgia, I think, is trying to heal the wounds, like you're talking about. I think we're kind of stuck in a loop going back to when things started to go wrong. And I think our unconscious is sort of doing that. Ends like Hollywood just collapses under the weight of yet another superhero film, because it doesn't come from there. But the bit that frustrates me is that what is associated with this transition of signs for the kind of that we're talking about, the sort of getting past 2020, if it's not fixed to physical media, there is a kind of decentralized opportunity for imagining ideas and being creative and being able to kind of use parts of these platforms to make something new, rather than whining about the fact that things that are dying aren't as good as what they used to be, like fucking magazines or whatever.
Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree. And if you're going to write something, like, don't write another shitty ripoff of 1984. Like, we know that story. And I feel like I love dystopias personally. I grew up reading them. I read all of them that I could. But that's writing a dystopia in 2017 is not a revolutionary act, and it's not brave. Because that's exactly what everybody expects. Like,
Precisely.
writing a utopia, or somehow like writing a story that's that actually pulls at people, where somehow we get through this. That's a challenge. That it's like we're so in the Game of Thrones, Walking Dead era, where it's like, we're like, yes, that feels like reality. Things get worse and people are awful, right? The revolutionary, the brave thing is to say something positive that's not garbage.
Well, fire also gives off warmth.
It does.
I think we spoke about this on some of the last couple of them, but standing, and I mean, this is kind of a personality thing which we both share, which is good, but the space weather gets better. So everyone's like, it's all going to collapse into some kind of Hunger Games nonsense. I'm like, well, Not if you play your Captain Jack right, because it's a challenging landscape. It's a firewalk. Let's stay with it. You're firewalking, but there is good stuff in there.
Yeah, and honestly, like looking at 2017 versus 18, 19, 20, I think there are more moves to make in 2017. They're going to be in a while. Like the decade's going to end on a pretty heavy note.
Yep.
And so, this fire is obnoxious and loud and bright. But when things are up in the air, right? When things are up in the air, it's easier to change their position than when they're nailed down.
Okay, everyone's going to take that on board. Let's, as we kind of, because by the time people listen to this, they'll be staring at Q1 2017. So let's get detailed in on what's coming up in. Let's say half one. Let's say first half of next year.
Okay. So let's see what the landmarks are. So one of the landmarks definitely for Q1, and this one will actually take us from Q1 to Q2, is Venus's retrograde. So Venus stations retrograde about every year and a half, right? So it's much more rare than Mercury, not quite as rare as Mars, which is every 2 years. And Venus's retrogrades last for about 6 weeks at a time. And then you have about sort of a month of entry ramp and then a month of exit, right? So people will be feeling this from about February to the end of May, but it's really concentrated on that equinoctial border. So Venus retrograde, this Venus retrograde will occur primarily in Aries. Venus stations retrograde at 13 tropical Aries, and then it'll retrograde back to 26 Pisces. And this goes from March 6th to, I believe, April 13th is the direct station. But again, give it a month on either side for when people are going to feel it and when events connected to it will happen. So like Mercury retrograde, so so with Mercury retrogrades, we take Mercury's significations, right? Like travel and communication and, electronic devices. And then we kind of mess them around, right? We take what should be a linear process of transportation and turn it into a big curvy loopy thing, right? We turn A to B to A to C to D to F to B, right? But we do that with Venus's significations, with a Venus retrograde. And so it's much more about exploring feelings, exploring contradictions between what you want and what you don't want, and what you like and what you don't like, realizing that you love and hate the same person, and then trying to figure that out. A lot of people, I think, very effectively apply the psychopomp, Hermes Cottonius as the psychopomp, that mythology, Hermes' time in the underworld, as a sort of myth structure for understanding the quality of Mercury retrograde time. And so you can do the same thing with Venus, but it's much more, it's Inanna's descent to meet her dark sister, Ereshkigal. And there's that myth cycle is almost certainly literally about the planet Venus, because part of the disappearance, and they're in the underworld now, is that you don't see Venus when Venus is retrograde. Venus disappears from view for about a month, and so it's a bardo, or it's an underworld of the heart. And so during Venus retrogrades, a lot of people end up being confused about what they want and what they don't want. Sometimes people stumble into relationships and they're not what they seem during Venus retrogrades. Just on a very simple level, I advise most people to not start a serious romantic commitment during that time. Doesn't mean you have to hermit off, but a lot of times it's a time where things are in flux on the level of the heart, the passions, all that. And so when you try to lock down or commit to something which is in flux, you've committed to something that'll be different in a month, right? The thing is, Venus does have economic effects, but I don't feel like I have a good beat on it. One thing that I can say that's very useful about thinking about this Venus retrograde is that you've been through it before. Unless you're 7 years old, you've been through it before. Venus does a retrograde in almost exactly the same span of degrees at about the same time of year every 8 years. So we did one of these in 2009 at the end of Q1, the beginning of Q2. We did the same thing in 2001, end of Q1, beginning of Q2, and the same in 1993, and you can just go back. And so, if you're looking at your own life, there are precedents for that. And it might be that this particular Venus retrograde is not a big deal for you. Right. But the way these work is a lot of times that'll be a button for some people, and every 8 years you'll get something really important. And so just looking at those periods of time, and if you look at 3 of them and you're like, meh, weren't a big deal, then this one will probably be fine for you. But if you look at those and they're kind of a big deal, then you can you can set your expectations so you're ready to handle that sort of journey this year. And that, I think that one will set off some of the other configurations that characterize 2017. That'll definitely trouble some people who thought they got their balance. There might be like, things are going to be fine. Okay, I've finally recovered. I know what I'm doing, and that'll probably throw some monkey wrenches in there. Venus retrograde is certainly a more volatile period if we're looking at volatile versus fixed. So that's a big one. And then that sort of is followed pretty shortly by Mercury's retrograde, which I don't necessarily... Actually, you know what? I'm going to back up. I missed something. Well, I didn't miss something. I just didn't talk about it yet. So basically, our Q1 to Q2, Venus retrograde, underworld Venus is going to escort us across that boundary, right? Before that, though, in February, we get our first eclipse in the Leo Aquarius series. So we'll have a lunar eclipse in Leo on February 10th, right? And then that's the companion to the solar eclipse in Leo, the total one that we're going to see later in the year in August, about 6 months later. And then we'll also see on February 26th, we'll have a good annular eclipse of the sun in Pisces, and that'll be the very last eclipse in the Pisces Virgo series, which we've been doing since the second half of 2015. So that pair of eclipses in February is sort of the goodbye Pisces, hello Leo, right? It's one it's got 1 foot in closing out 1 year and a half cycle of changes, and it's got another foot in starting up a new year and a half of changes. Right, so we get eclipse in February, and then we get then Venus stations retrograde in early March, and then that takes us across the equinox, and then pretty much right after Venus gets done being retrograde, Mercury stations retrograde. Less of a big deal. Mercury stations retrograde 3 times a year, right? It's not like a once every year and a half thing. But what is interesting is Uranus's direct station. Mercury's direct station. Mercury stations direct the first week of May, right on top of Uranus. The two will be very tightly aligned. And Uranus is the surprise button. Uranus is the Joker card, the wild card, the fool card. And so when other planets hit that, you just get disruptive. You get things which disrupt plans, right? And sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. Disruption is often not good for business, but individual lives are full of both happy and awful surprises.
So
but there's definitely a little.
If I've got that correct, so he stations direct, so he returns from the underworld with like, ta-da!
Right.
Look at this thing you now know.
Yeah, hanging out with Uranus, and I feel like there's this relationship between the god names that we use and the planets, and that relationship is a pretty good one for Mercury. Like if we look to stories or experiences with Hermes, we get really close to, the Hermes and Mercury are strongly connected. Uranus is a little bit different, partially because it was named by astronomers rather than evolving organically out of a culture. And so with Uranus, Rick Tarnas, who is the father of one of your other guests, Becca Tarnas, he's advocated that we should actually refer to the Prometheus myth. And when we're talking about Uranus, that he's this, I believe you refer to them as civilizing tricksters, or you probably got that from somewhere, but you use that term. Like the one who steals the fire and gets punished for it and empowers, but, doesn't necessarily mean that the humans are going to use fire wisely. Right. But it's definitely, it's Uranus is about surprises and game changers. Right. And, the divine fire was certainly a game changer.
It's a good match because it was William Herschel, who discovered Uranus. And when he did, one, he didn't name it that. He wanted to name it George after the king because he's an idiot. But he doubled the size of the solar system when he found it, because we didn't know there was that far out. So when you talk about surprise and game change, like it's a good idea to map to Prometheus, because that's exactly the presence of Uranus does things like that. It's like, holy shit, it is literally a new game. Like now it's double the size.
Yeah, and also when Uranus was discovered, within the next couple of years, we have Kant publishing the Critique of Pure Reason, and the United States throws off kingship.
Yep.
Right. And then, France is not far behind. Like we have the literal game, lots of games were changed. And so it was interesting that that name didn't stick. And literally the name of a king was proposed and they said no. Not only because that's silly, but literally the coming of that planet into our collective conscious awareness coincided with the first, I would say, the first fatal wound to kingship.
Absolutely.
Divine fire in the face.
So we haven't this is coming out on whatever the 17th is, where we'll be in retrograde for Christmas, and the Santa's going to be dodging a few planets over 24, 25. So is there some advice we can give? Like, please, for the love of God, do not mention politics at your Christmas celebrations, or something similar from an astrological perspective we would impart as we close out the show?
Yeah. Just don't do it.
It's probably good advice, realistically, at Christmas, which is just relax.
There is Mars does a thing right around New Year's, which will probably be fine for most people. It's a Mars-Neptune conjunction with a perfect antitia to Uranus and Aries. So basically what that means is that so you have Mars, right? And then Neptune, again, Neptune is imagination and delusion and vision and all these things. But Mars-Neptune, generally, I, for example, don't experience that as unpleasant. I'm usually just super imaginative. My vision is very vigorous for a couple days. But a lot of times you have it for people who are gonna fly off the handle and be crazy. It's a pretty good trigger for that. And then with a little spark from Uranus, there is. I really hope that there aren't attacks around New Year's celebrations. That's certainly a configuration which opens the possibility to that. I want that to not be the case. But
I think my femstrologist Susan Miller said that as well. It's like it's a year for having a New Year's party in a house.
Yeah, well, and don't be the terrorist in your family situation.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Like it may be that you are right about things and that they are important, but it may not be. 7 eggnogs in may not be the best time to have that fiery dialogue.
Nice one. Well, Mr. Coppock, thank you very much. I look forward to these now traditional half-yearly catch-ups for people who would like to know more about what you got going on and how to find you and so on. Go for it.
Yeah, so I'm my website is austincoppock.com. So it's AustinCoppock. And I should have my almost tumorously large write-up of 2017, the patterns that are there and what I can make of them, up on my website to read. That's going to come out the morning of the 22nd. I will also be announcing my 2017 schedule of classes for people who want to learn astrology. And yeah, that's a good place to find me. And I co-edited and contributed to a book of essays on astrological magic that'll be coming out, I think, at the end of the first quarter next year. So that hasn't been announced yet, but it will be, and it's going to be awesome.
Nice. Well, sir, thank you very much, and I guess all the best for Christmas and New Year's.
Indeed, to you as well, and to everybody listening. Have a nice holiday.
2017 coming at you, if you can believe it. Some great thoughts today on how to think about the year ahead from Austin, the fire motif, the configurations to look out for, and if that's your sort of thing, get over to austincoppock.com and sign up. I especially like the discussion around attitude and headspace and avoiding defeatism. I'll have so much more to say about this in the coming months, but it's definitely good advice to take away with you into the holiday season and New Year. And speaking of, the show is in fact running right through. There are even some exciting surprises, I guess you would call them that, coming up during the festive period that you will want to subscribe for. So find the show on YouTube, in your favorite podcatcher, on Facebook, or at runesoup.com. The next episode will not be out until after Christmas, of course, so let me close by offering up a prayer that your holiday is filled with light and peace and respite. Until next time.